about why this tool, is so unique and so impactful and can really change people's lives.
I think most universities won't change, but the big change will be that some will.
The big thing that's going to hit us is a major demographic shift in the country. Probably won't have a huge impact on elite universities other than to make them even more impossibly elite than they already are.
We'll have much more multidisciplinary studies in order to equip students with tools for an uncertain world.
We have to uplift the positions of the teachers. We have to talk about excellency, meaning not to compromise about the quality, the diversity, the inclusion.
With new certificates of relevance to the various professions that will be as highly regarded and highly coveted and meaningful.
Great. So that was really very exciting. I want to welcome everybody. Shalom, Bruchim Habaim. Welcome to this session. This is Isra-Ed-Tech. Hopefully you've made it to the right breakout session that you wanted. And if not, you can escape. The advantage of Zoom is that we will not catch you leaving this session. So you're welcome to evade at any time. My name is Shelley Kedah. I'm the director of the Shlichut Institute within the Jewish Agency, and with me together today in this conversation is Professor Ken Stein. If you can just wave so we can see you in the window. Professor Ken Stein is the founding director of the Center for Israel Education and a host of other titles, very important titles that I will not outline at this moment. And also my friend and colleague Orit Mitzner, if you can also wave so we can see that you're there. And Orit is the National Director of Programs for the IAC, the Israeli American Council, and we're so happy to have this opportunity to have a conversation between the three of us in the presence of you, 140 some of our about to become, I think, friends in this scenario. I want to start with a disclaimer, and the disclaimer is none of us are techies, none of us are digital experts, none of us really are proficient in, augmented reality and virtual reality and all sorts of wonderful things that I've heard throughout this conference. What we are, though, are educators, and Israel educators particularly. And what we want to be sharing with you this afternoon or this evening or morning, depending on where your time zone is we want to share some of the insights of the things that we've been doing in our various capacities by means of really sharing best practices amongst peers. This is by no means what we will share with you the only way to do things or the best way to do things, but we think that some of the things that we've learned may resonate with some of you. I want to encourage you to, as we speak throughout the conversation, and we're not going to be hijacking this entire hour, to write questions and comments in the chat. If you would be so kind as to introduce yourself as you write the comments. For example, if you are writing to me right now and saying, hi, hello, I'm happy to see you too, please just identify yourself and say, my name is and I am from, and that would be great for us to know where the question is coming from. And obviously, I encourage everybody to be very active on the chat. I want to start just by framing this conversation in the spirit of our time, not just time of coronavirus or COVID-19, but really in the time of Ben HaMetzarim, in dire straits. In our Jewish calendar, as most of you probably know, we've entered the period of 3 weeks between the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av. This period is commonly known as Amim Ben HaMetzarim, the days in between the constraints. Think of it as like an ocean or a sea in between two lands. And I think it's quite appropriate that we're having this conversation right now, because it seems that we've left safe shores with this pandemic, and we're now somewhere in the constraints between the two. And I want to assure us that there is land on the other side, or I want to assure myself, I think that's also legitimate. There is land on the other side, And what we want to be discussing now is how do we manage this sea? We are all, I think, land people, most of us, and we've now thrown into this sea or ocean of new experiences educationally. And that's maybe something that we would like to discuss this afternoon. I want to really jump completely in and already shoot the first question at Professor Stein, at Ken, and ask, in terms of this arena, the sea that we're at, what have you found that actually enhances Israel education? Let's talk at the positive. What helps us at sea? What actually helps us with this digital age to do our work better? Professor Stein, please.
The most essential element for doing our work better is having excellent educators who know the story, who have the passion, who have access to the materials, and can make learning interesting. Whether we are in a pandemic or not, a tsunami or not, we need people who can convey Israel's story and do it with passion and with a commitment that they want their students to learn the story, belong to the story, but they're not willing to provide to the students politics or preaching. That's what's most important as we navigate through these difficult times.
Fantastic. Professor Ken, when you work a lot on the online sphere before even the pandemic, and you have, for those of you who don't know, I will plug it in. There's a wonderful website for the Center for Israel Education, which I strongly encourage you to visit as soon as this session is over, not while we're on Zoom right now. Can you share a little bit about the insight that went, and your thinking that went behind the website, and how you're utilizing the web to your advantage when it comes to imparting Israel knowledge?
Yeah, the overarching concept for the Center for Israel Education was two philosophical motivations. One, to educate and teach others about Jewish survival and Zionism and the state of Israel, with the single premise or enduring understanding that you have to control your own destiny and you have to engage in self-determination. And there's a story to be told on how you do that. And if you understand the story and you appreciate it, its complexity, and you can do it through the use of original sources, then you can be persuaded that the story is valid, it's part of your identity, it's part of who you are, and it's part of what you want to stay attached to. The second part of the website is really having to do with Deuteronomy 6:7, which is namely, teach it diligently unto thy children. And if we do that, then we have commitments to the Center for Israel Education and what we do. What we do primarily is we try to provide sources, acquisition to the sources, acquisition to interpretation of the sources that are non-polemical, point out to the student or the adult or the educator that you can acquire your own knowledge and your own information by having access. One of the great difficulties I had as a student at the University of Michigan was I didn't have access to Hebrew and Arabic sources. Luckily, I grew up in an environment where I spoke German, so I had some access to German sources about the Middle East. I had to learn Hebrew, I had to learn Arabic. And what I found after I started teaching in the 70s and 80s, that most of the material still remained in Hebrew and Arabic. And one of the great goals, or the important goals in the Center for Israel Education, is to provide source materials that otherwise would not be available anyplace else in the world. I think we're beginning to do that. The one thing for certain is the Center for Israel Education will never run out of materials to provide to people. And we will always be able to continue to put it into context. Themes about the study of Israel, contemporary issues about the study of Israel, analytical pieces about the state of Israel. Again, without left, without right, without preaching, just with teaching.
So you speak a lot about accessibility, I think, and really making knowledge accessible, making knowledge palatable for different audiences, and really having it within reach for us educators, which I think is so important. I think that sometimes in this age of over-information, it's very difficult to actually understand what we should really be using as educators, especially when it comes to Israel education. If we just Google Israel on Google, we will find so many different answers, and some of them are probably not the equipment that we would like to use. I'm trying to be very politically correct. I see a few people smiling at me.
It's an understatement, Shelley. It's an understatement.
I was trying to be a little bit subversive when I said that. Yeah, so it's actually very good that you're bringing that to us. I want to switch to Orit, because as you speak of accessibility, and you spoke about the accessibility of knowledge, I want to ask Orit specifically about the accessibility of culture and experience. I'm sure some of you were watching the plenary before us with heads of major initiatives in the Jewish community, and they spoke a lot about the challenge of creating an Israel experience from afar, and how we make culture, Israeli culture, accessible. So Orit, maybe you can share what you think about that. Can we do that? And if so, how can we do it well?
Right. First of all, thank you for moderating this panel, and lovely to be here with everybody. I'm gonna start with something Ken said and then push from that. Ken spoke about Israel education and the importance, of course, of Israel education. And I think one of the things that happened in the last 4 months is that we were able to bring Israel different narratives and different aspects of Israel in a way that not necessarily we were beforehand, because we were less accessible, not because we didn't have the technology. It's not about having the technology, but because we didn't maybe use it as we could, and maybe had different barriers doing that. And I think what we did, what we tried to do in the past 4 months, is really bridge that geographical gap between Israel and the United States, but even within the United States, for people who are living in faraway locations that not necessarily have a Jewish center around them or an Israeli center around them, and so on and so forth, but also through different tools that all of a sudden we were able to use. And then maybe taking a step back, we understood what, as I'm sure most of the people in this, if not all the people in this conversation, that things are not going to be the same, at least for the next few months, if not for eternity from now on, right? And we understood that we need to create a different experience. It's not about changing the content. It's not about changing what it is that we want to bring about Israel and how the fact that we want to engage people with Israel, but it's how we're doing that. And we learned really that from, again, we failed fast and we did a few mistakes, but we were able to learn from them and really came up with some sort of a guidelines that really were in the forefront of everything that we did in the past 4 months and everything that we are trying to do moving forward. And it really came down to four elements. One, the live element. Having people like we are now, having people seeing each other, having people engaging with one another, even if it's just by looking at people's eyes, even if it's just by seeing people's name, but have that live experience, and even more so with the different tools that we have, if it's Answer Gardens, if it's Padlet, Kahoot, and so on and so forth, but having it live. The experience of seeing people and engaging with people rather than see it on Facebook and so on and so forth made a huge difference in the level of engagement, in the way that we were able to communicate and speak about Israel, different elements, culture, Hebrew, and so on and so forth. The other thing was reframing what it is that we're doing. It's not webinars, it's online experiences. It's not about having different people. It could be a panel, but we're going to have a Q&A in a few minutes, allowing people to engage in the conversation with us. So it's not about having a webinar, but it's about having online experience from the get-go. So the flyer will look different. It's not going to look like any other webinar, but it's going to invite you to an experience that is taking place online rather than offline. And it's going to showcase the benefits of the online. if it's the speaker that is all of a sudden from Israel and we are able to share, if it's different people from different places in the United States and so on. The fourth, that it's not copy-paste. We needed to create different content, new content that is relevant and accurate to the online experience. What we were able to do offline and what we are still able to do offline, not necessarily translate to the online sphere, right? So we needed to create different content using different tools. And the last thing is partnerships. In the past 4 months, within the educational programs of the IAC, we worked with 65 different partners. I counted this morning for this meeting. We never did that before. We always had partnerships, but never on that scale. And having that ability to create those partnerships between organizations, between different organizations that we never thought that we will create partnerships with, if it's museum, if it's national parks, and so on and so forth, coming from Israel, of course, made a huge difference to the entire experience and allowed a more significant, I think, in some ways, of Israeli engagement that we had before.
Thank you. I think those 4 points are really very good for all of us to adopt as we try to think how we shift what our programming was to the online sphere. And there are a few comments that came up in the chat in terms of a webinar with Q&A or in terms of engagement. And I want to share a little bit about the challenge of engagement. And I'm looking specifically at all of you now in the screens. Some of you I do not know, and some of you I do know, which is great to see again. But something that I have been feeling as an educator teaching online, and I shared this with Professor Stein and Ulrich, is the lack of connection in terms of eye contact and the fact that we can't really look at each other and we're not really seeing. And I wanted to share some of the experiments that we've been doing with the sphere of shlichim to sort of break the anxiety first on our part as educators in trying to create these relationships via a screen. And secondly, really to see if we can actually deepen it. I think there's if I'm looking for a metaphor that defines the difference between interaction and engagement, whether it's online or offline, it's probably the difference between breadth and depth when it comes to our Israel programming. So I think that when we're looking at connections or interactions, we are looking at the breadth of it. And I think what online has enabled us to do through Facebook Live and through YouTube Live, and some of you have been asking us to share after this session the different platforms that we use, and I think we should be sharing. All these mega events is really a breadth of audiences. And we look at mega numbers. If we look at numbers from all of your communities think of your biggest events that you've done this year, whether it's Yom Ha'atzmaut or any live shows, and there were so many of them came out of the IAC and also out of Israel. And I think those have a huge importance because I think at this time we try to feel that we're not alone. And I think as Jewish educators and as Israel educators, we should think about what can create breadth, what can go beyond the school, the synagogue, the JCC, or the Hillel community and create mega things. And these are important interactions. However, when it comes to engagement, we probably have to go into depth and into something that's more smaller scale. We've experimented with something very, very simple called virtual coffee dates, taking a virtual calendar and for people to sign up to have a Hebrew conversation with the Shinshin, with the Shaliach, or with something, or with a different type of Shaliach, to have a Hebrew conversation. And we found that a lot of people were actually looking for a one-on-one connection. They were looking for the screen that we're looking at, but just to look at one-on-one. We're now in the midst of a huge experiment, Shlichim IL. As all of you know, summer camp Shlichim have not arrived in the United States this summer because of the situation of summer camps and also because of coronavirus. But there are 75 Shlichim actually working on summer camps at the moment and are being Shlichim online. And I think that's a very weird concept for all of us. Screens at camp is a weird concept, but it's interesting to see how the relationship is being built and being done that. I want to encourage us to think also about another thing that we've done, which is meetups. Is everybody familiar with meetups, professional meetups? Ever heard of them? Ever encountered them? So think of Israel engagement meetups and things that we can maybe do in terms of meeting Israelis that we couldn't do beforehand, that maybe we can do now through all our distant relatives, cousins, schools in Israel, etc. I think it's something that we could also think about. And we found 3 technological tools, and Orit has mentioned that we don't need to invent technology, we need to adapt it, that were really useful for us. The first one is actually an Israeli technology called Powtoon. Nod your head if you heard about it. Have you heard about Powtoon? Powtoon is a very easy, straightforward way to create short films. It's free at the beginning, and then like anything in life, it doesn't get free anymore. But you get it for free for a while. And we found that it's a trigger to entice people, to attract people to come into a content area and then delve deeper. That was really great. Padlet is another platform that we've used. I don't know if are people familiar with Padlet, Powtoon. I'm going to write it in the chat. For Natalie, thank you for asking. It's called Powtoon. And I'm now talking about Padlet. I don't know if you've heard about Padlet. Padlet is like a Post-it type of experience and creates shared boards. And that was something that helped us do a post-programming or a pre-programming ideas, helped us create content that students will read beforehand or congregants. And that was really great. Thank you, Matt, for also writing Powtoon. I'm sure everybody's familiar with Mentimeter. Mentimeter is, again, free at the beginning and then not so free after a few uses. But everybody's smiling at me. Yes, that's just the way it is. But really, I really encourage you to play with Mentimeter. That helps verbalize and visualize conversations that we're having right now. You know, what is the most resonant word that we have, different surveys, etc. First one was Powtoon, Yifat. And also on my list is, and this is a little bit for the more advanced, we tried to start experimenting with virtual escape rooms because we've learned that some of the online experiences that people are looking for, especially when it comes to Israel engagement and education, are not synchronic. They want to consume the online experience on their own time. Just like Professor Stein said, his website and his resources exist at all hours of the day. So you don't have to be awake in the West Coast or asleep in Israel to use them. They're there. And I think that's something that we need to think about when we create technological tools. And these tools are evergreen. So I want to go back to Orit and Ken and have you jump in. And I will also give an example. A guy from Toronto is asking me about an example for escape rooms platform. I will put it in the chat momentarily. But I want to give Orit and Ken an opportunity also to jump in and share.
Right. So let me say
Okay.
something about the website. Let me say something about my own experience teaching online. This past semester, a class on the Arab-Israeli conflict to 84 students stretching from Shanghai to Coral Gables, and talk a little bit about what worked for me, where I stumbled because I was a traditional teacher who stood in front of a classroom. The key for us, or the key for me, was changing up my modality of teaching more frequently. In other words, for me, it was using videos, using discussion questions, using the chat, engaging the students to respond immediately, called on the students once they responded in the chat, and then got into a discussion with 2 to 3 of them, of maybe out of 25 or 30 who responded. The second that was proved to be most essential was being iterative, repetitive, and being brief, but not redundant. And I found that work to be very, very well when I was talking about the nuance of Arab-Israeli diplomacy, the nuance of presidents and prime ministers. The students absolutely enjoyed it. They enjoyed the repetitiveness because they are not familiar with what we are familiar with. I taught more broader questions that I had never taught before. For example, I tried to encourage them to think about what is a turning point in history as compared to what is a legacy moment in history. A turning point would be Pearl Harbor or the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, or maybe Rabin's assassination or Martin Luther King's assassination. But a legacy moment is a moment in history that is not finished. And I did this in anticipation of teaching them the 67 war. And I wanted them to understand all the different reasons why the 67 war wasn't finished yet. And when I got finished, I spent 25 minutes teaching them the difference, and they fully got the single important reason why the 67 war changed Israel, changed the Middle East, changed American foreign policy. I found using pre-recorded information does not work well. It doesn't create interaction, although recorded sessions for students does work if you keep it online for several weeks after. I taught more controversial questions than I taught forever before, and it really kept the students interested. The primary question I asked that received almost 45 minutes of attention was, is a two-state solution really necessary? In whose interest is it? Maybe it's not in Israel's interest or Palestinian interest or Jordanian interest. Maybe it's only in the interest of people who believe in a two-state solution. Well, you can imagine that the students got deeply engaged, and every time they spoke about an answer, I made them support their answer. I made them find supportive data and information that was accurate. I have learned that in teaching online, it can be creative for the students. It can be daunting for the professor. And if you're an old dinosaur like I am, it took me a while. But what I had, which was the very basis of my existence as a teacher, was the content and the information, the passion and the knowledge of how to use the information. So I could dance on a thimble. I could dance around all the different topics and still come back with the students without telling them that they were either right or they were either wrong. And they loved the open-endedness of it because without me telling them, they understood it was complex. And for me, the 8 sessions of teaching the Arab-Israeli conflict online, I think made me a better teacher even after 43 years. And I think it kept the students' interest. So that was really important for me. And the only other item I'd like to mention about the website is there's an article on the website on the homepage called Proven Success in Israel Education, Context, Sources, and Perspective. I revised this article specifically for this presentation. And it gives you the philosophy of what the website's about, but it also allows you to do what the website does that no other website does. It mentions an idea, it mentions a concept, it mentions a source, and then it gives you the opportunity to click into the source for you to go deeper. So however, whatever level you want, you can go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper as if you're going into a really complex version of Dungeons and Dragons. And I suspect that when you go into deepness of the history of modern Israel, it will be neither a dungeon nor will you face any dragon.
Thank you so much, Professor Stein. There's a lot of activity going on in the chat, which I hope you're following. People are sharing tools and ideas.
Good, I'll do it.
Sorry?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm saying there's a lot of activity going on in the chat and people are sharing all sorts of tools. And I want to encourage more of that. But Orit, can you also add to our conversation here from your perspective, please?
Yeah. 2 things that I wanna add. One is that we also, on top of all the different tools that is still coming up on the chat, and fortunately enough, we'll have the chat available even afterwards, so we can keep on learning from those options that people are bringing up. One of the things that we also need to take under consideration is that Zoom and online experiences allow us different types of experiences. If it's a big group, if it's a small group, if it's creating a way for people to engage with a high note speaker and then break into smaller group to go more into depth in different situations and so on and so forth. One of the things that we learned is the different age groups and different target audience have different needs and different things touch them. Different engagement tools and different ways that we are doing the online experience are touching them. For example, for kids, we noticed that sharing PowerPoints, if it's not part of a very interactive experience for them, is not doing anything beside actually get them disengaged. So we are not using as many PowerPoints and things for kids. We saw with teens that if they have something to accomplish, if they have a mission, if they have a task that they can do either by themselves or in smaller groups in between, that's something that gets them more engaged. We saw with adults, they want to have those intimate, more in-depth conversations. So different needs and different target audiences require from us to rethink and revisit and reimagine and bring about different tools that we can use for each one of them. The second thing that I want to say, and this is something that we learned from all the data that we were able to get throughout those 4 months via registration and survey that we sent to the different target audience, and from, of course, conversation with our educators, is the importance of empowering the educators. So one of the things that we did is we did an initial training, but also an ongoing training to our educators in order for them to feel in control, empowered, know how to use this platform, know how to bring themselves into this platform. What works for them? For some, Answer Garden, they love it. They will use it. They will do magic with it, right? They will ask difficult questions with Answer Gardens, and they will have this amazing interactive conversation with their audience. For others, it will be something different. So I think that's another thing that moving forward, we need to take under consideration the question, how do we train and retrain and ongoing training, given the different tools and allowing them to bring themselves into this experience?
Thank you. I want to challenge all of us, not just us three now chatting to each other, to think about transformation from virtual to real. We know that one of the challenges for Israel education and engagement is the fact that Israel is a foreign country and a foreign concept for many people. It's not necessarily something they feel automatically connected to, not necessarily something they will automatically engage with. And now that we have the distancing of a virtual platform versus a real platform, how can we really make sure that our virtual means, our digital means feel actual? What type of content, perhaps, and methodology can we use to make sure that the people feel that this is a real experience and not just a virtual, off-the-screen type of engagement, which I think is very, very important for us in Israel, making Israel part of their lives. So I'm opening up to everything, to everybody, to either write in the chat or raise your hand and jump in and think together with us. How do we do this?
Shelley,
and obviously, Professor Stein, please.
Yeah, Shelley, if I may.
Please.
I think the last point that you made is a terribly important one. The study of Israel in the United States is not a primary area of focus for American Jewry. We have to remember that in Israel, people learn Israel because they live it. They speak Hebrew and they know the country and they're Gadna or they're IDF, and they have an Israel experience daily. In the United States, it's something that you have to acquire. More often than not, you have to pay to acquire. More often than not, you have to have the guidance of parents who are willing to help you do that. And in the academic world, regrettably, most students who learn about Israel learn about it through the conflict. They don't learn about Israeli culture or society or literature or music. So what we're trying to do on the website is provide students, for example, access to Israeli streaming of videos and of movies, of Shissel and Fauda and the Beauty and the Baker, and all of those that give an understanding of Israel's dimensions. And it isn't just a matter of startup Israel or startup nation. It's a matter of understanding that Israelis have likes and dislikes and passions about their culture, as Arit mentioned, that we should explore and we should push, and it's far beyond the conflict and it's far beyond presidents' relationship with prime ministers. But we in the United States have to realize that it's really a minority of people, of American Jews, who want to pay any attention to Israel. And we need Israelis' help to help us do it better and do it deeper and do it wider and do it more consistently. So being head of an institute like Shlichut can help us. And if the Shlichim know the story before they get here, then they can help our teenagers and our young adults go through these very difficult years.
Actually,
Thank you. I think,
if I can really quickly, just because I think what Ken just said, and I think what Noah comments was also, it's relevant here. No, we don't need to be experts in everything. And I think now what happened with the online is we understood how easier it is for us to use people who are experts in different aspects of Israel education, and we can more easily access those people and those resources and use them in our own educational, in the way that we are bringing Israel to our own audiences, right? So using different shlichim. So maybe I'm a shlicha and I'm not fully aware of a certain aspect, but someone else is, but he lives in Milwaukee. It doesn't matter anymore, right? It used to be a barrier. Now it's not. Now we have the opportunity to bring them and then just have the conversation and move it forward. So I think that's another huge opportunity here for us.
We just finished a 4-day, 7-hour-a-day online course for 87 or 88 educators from all over North America and Mexico. We had 49 sessions over 4 days. And we brought people from all over the world to participate. I mean, Reuven Chazan and Gil Troy were there, but they live in Jerusalem. We had Jack Wertheimer up in Westchester. We had, people up in Boston who participated all in one session. And it proved to be terribly beneficial, because people who otherwise it would be very costly to bring these people together, now all of a sudden there they were talking about a topic in an hour and 15 minutes, which was eye-opening to some people. What we also realized is sitting in an armchair for a long period of time is really, really difficult, unless you have padded bicycle shorts on.
Even in that, I think that's not even for people who are a little bit more active, maybe like myself, it proves very difficult. Thank you, Deborah, for sharing HebrewPublic.org. I hope that everybody's seeing it in the chat. Seeing HebrewPublic.org as a resource. I want to really push us to think of the level of engagement that we create with Israelis throughout our activities, and really see what type of deep engagements we can create beyond really the things that we've said. And I wonder, Orit, if you can speak a little bit about, even broadening the mission, I think, and being a little bold. This conference, for example, for IAC, and also, reaching out to full partnerships, as you said, that you've never done before. How can we learn from these experiences in enhancing our online Israel engagement?
Right. I think, and even more so with other organization that have it's an Israeli-based organization that has participants, and all of a sudden we can do more easily immersive experiences, ongoing immersive experiences between the two communities, between the community that lives in the United States and the community that lives in Israel. So I think one of the things that happened for us is really the understanding that we can push to bring, again, more knowledge, more experiences, engage with speakers from Israel that usually we needed to wait for them to come to the United States, if at all. And if they did, what is the tour that they are doing? And all of a sudden we are able to bring more voices from different aspects and different worlds of Israel. So that allows us to broaden that spectrum, not only for adults, also for kids to be in a session, a multiple session with, for example, Beit Tfutzot, and to have their grandparents come on up to that session and to speak together about their roots and their stories and how they got there, and having a grandfather and a grandmother sitting in Israel and their grandkids sitting in the United States and having a conversation and having an activity together, and they're sharing their pictures and sharing their pictures and so on and so forth. That's something that we weren't able to do before. And that's something that we are eager to see how can we continue even when the offline, and hopefully we will have an offline experiences very, very soon. But how can we continue that sort of engagement? How do we still bring in kids from Chinuch Lepsagot for Education for Excellence to our summer hackathons with teens in LA. We don't have a summer hackathon. We didn't have a summer hackathon this year, but we are planning on doing an online mini hackathon soon in September. How do I bring those kids from Chinuch Lepsagot in Israel to participate fully and be part of groups and work together with Israeli American and Jewish American kids? These options are now accessible. I know that they were accessible beforehand, but all of a sudden we are more open, we as educators and organizations, but also our end users, the participants, are more open to experience something different, that it's online, but bring something different to their lives and open their minds and open their ability to see Israel as something bigger than what they used to.
Shelley,
sorry for 1 second, just say, noting the chat, Timna in Texas is sharing the experience of connecting 7th graders. And I don't know if this was a pre-existing connection and you had the ability to create that, but I think through, our relationships, through partnerships or the IEC or Tel Aviv University, maybe we can be bold in generating these. Please, Ken.
Yeah, partnerships, relationships, expanding our boundaries, being more engaged with one another, all terribly important. Still, it's critical for the students or those who are being educated, for us to increase their intellectual, not just knowledge base, but what's the effective learning or skills that they get. So if you're going to read a source document, read why Rabin signed the agreement with Arafat in 1993. You read the page that Yehuda Avner took from him, and you find out what the reason was for his motivation for doing so. And most people think it was because he was interested in peace with Arafat. No, it was interested basically because he wanted to change the nature of the neighbors next door. He didn't want a theological Islam next door. Have the students read it. They read it, and then you pull out of them, so what motivated Rabin to do it? What was he thinking strategically? What was going through his head? And by the way, was that anything different than the way he thought strategically prior to June 67? Then have the kids make the connection between the two. Let them understand the context and perspective. I would also say, what a great opportunity for them to interpret documents. You have them read the Declaration of Independence, and I'm not talking about Israel's here, I'm talking about the American one. Compare the two of them. Let them make the judgments about what they said about liberty and freedom. By the way, the word freedom doesn't appear in the American document, and there's more religion in the Israeli document than there is in the American one. Let them pull that out and let them go, wow, I didn't know that. That's what you want to have a kid walk away with when you're engaging with them. You want them to go, oh, really? I didn't know that. That's cool. Because if they do, then ultimately you have gotten to them and you've created a memorable moment. You've expanded their memory and they will remember it, not because you told it to them, but because they extracted it from what they did in the learning process. And that is the key. When we go after kids, we go after teens, we go after young adults and have them understand Israel's story. Make them feel better about themselves personally, as well as they'll feel about the story. Still there?
Yeah.
Yes. We agree. I think we agree. I wanna really open up. We have 10 more minutes. Really open up to questions and notions in the chat. I want to do something very bold and say that if people want to make a comment, and there's a few people who are now commenting, just unmute yourself and jump into the conversation and share your wisdom with us. So, for example, if you are Debbie Snow or Ilana Mushkin, who's just written, meetup group in Israel, Ed-Tech ecosystem, sounds fascinating. Please share your knowledge with us. That would be great.
May I ask a question?
Of course, please. Just introduce yourself.
My name is Inbar Levy. I teach at the Adolphson Educational Campus in Las Vegas. I'm Israeli. I've been teaching for 7 years.
And you're next to my friend Lauren. Hi, Lauren.
Israel education for 7 years now. I'm going on my 8th. I love getting all the resources. Thank you everybody for sharing. What I find to be the most complex dilemma or issue as a teacher, and I love what you say about making Israel real for them, right? Because they're not waking up in Israel and thinking about joining the army. It's not real in a sense. So, and I feel like the complexity that Israel brings is such a nice platform for older students. The thing is, how do you do that in a nice balanced way where I can present narratives, dare I say, Palestinian narratives, and side by side show Israeli narratives, and from that be able to pull the complexity without stepping on any.
Mm-hmm.
How do you find the line?
On any narrative toes. So I can say my perspective, and Ken, I think can definitely is the expert on this. I would say one of the issues that I have with digital learning and online learning like we're doing right now is that it's two-dimensional. I hope I'm getting this right, and not, it's not 3D. It's not an immersive type of. You don't see depth. Again, you just skim, and I think that's something that we need to take into account literally. As we plan an educational session, in terms of saying that if we'll bring one narrative and then another narrative, there will be some sort of a balancing act that will create some sort of an understanding out of it, because it's just not. I don't think this platform allows just by presenting two narratives to create that balance. I will say that I think that Israel education is complex. And we should be hugging complexity because complexity is the essence of Israel education. It's the essence of the word Israel. And we shouldn't be looking at it as different narratives and different things, because I think that's where we'll get lost in general and trying to balance something that is deep and not like a seesaw. And Ken will know the answer.
Not only do you, I don't have the answer. Not only do you get lost, but you'll find yourself at the bottom of a well.
Mm-hmm.
Don't, if you try and teach narratives parallel, you'll overstate one and understate the other. The key is when I was at the University of Michigan as a graduate student, I didn't take a course in the British Empire narrative or the Islamic narrative or modern Middle Eastern narrative. I took courses in history. The word narrative has only come about in the last 20 years because people have special interests that they're trying to promote. So I would stay away from it, and I would not stay away from the complexity, and don't use the word complexity as a veil or a curtain to say, well, it's too difficult for me to approach.
On the contrary, I think complexity should be at the essence of what we teach if we want the kids to leave our school and become, good citizens of the world. They need to be able to see lots of gray.
Absolutely.
Definitely. I mean, that's a tool that we can teach them, especially with online learning, where they are, even in this moment, I don't know how many of you are also doing emails and browsing the web, and obviously everybody's very attuned to the session. I'm saying sarcastically, but it is what we do. So we need to always, we need to be able to give them good sieves to understand and experience and, you know, digest words. There's a disagreement about narratives, which I think I will also embrace, because I think this is a good conversation. I want to say something to all of us that we know, and that is that comfort is not a Jewish value. It doesn't say in our scripture, thou shall, you know, vow to comfort. Meaning is a Jewish value, though. So maybe that's something that could help. And Jeremy, you're welcome to jump in, or anybody else who would like to ask a question or give a comment, because we have more time.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in. Apropos to the problem that you presented, and in terms of discussing what's going on in Israel, my students basically did the same thing to the Israeli Vice Consul, who came to speak about the world of diplomats. And they started asking what's going on in America and with racism, and how can you define how all of this is happening, and so forth and so on. And these are issues that I think that they're important, and they're important to discuss, but it's very difficult for us on Zoom to touch these topics and to control, because of the large quantity of students that we have on Zoom. We're not in the classroom. In the classroom, you can approach and you can deal with it. But when they're on Zoom, it's a whole different issue. And you don't want to hurt anybody, and you don't want to go into places where we're going to have difficulty and problems. And I think that there's just so many other things you can do collaboratively with students in Israel, together with students in your classroom, or even together with the elderly population. My students connect with elderly people in Canada and the United States that are retired, and they do reading with them, and they have discussions with them about different places in Israel. And they basically travel together, in their armchairs. And there's just so many beautiful things about Israel and topics that you can do. Stay away from politics and religion, because we're educators. If we're talking about the elementary school, junior high school, and junior high school, there's just so much to discuss and to talk about. We should take topics that we can compare and contrast, that your students can bring and talk about their community and about their neighborhood and their homes and their traditions, or even traditions of food and how they celebrate holidays. And the students in Israel can counter and tell their story. There's just a lot of beautiful things and projects that you can do together to collaborate, that it doesn't even pay to go into it, because the idea, especially with Corona, is that we want to unify people, and we want people to be together, and we want them to see the positive and to see the good, and to gain knowledge, and to feel that the world is at their fingertips, and that we're unifying ourselves, and we're not looking for ways to find conflict at this point in time, since they have so many other things to worry about, whether it's money issues at home, situations that are going around them, being far from their friends, and so forth and so on. So that's just my opinion, and what I experienced as a teacher with my students over the last few months in Israel, and it really worked beautifully. And the kids were very positive, and they look forward to coming to class, because they never knew what was going to happen.
Thank you.
Shelley,
Yeah, please,
I also think that one of the things that the online is allowing us all of a sudden to the extreme is to have a conversation between professionals, between all of us coming from this different spectrum of the Jewish education and the Jewish world. The whole purpose of this conference was for the professionals within the educational world to come together from Israel and from around the world. We have participants from all over the world to come together and think and ask questions one another and learn from one another. And I think if we'll be able to continue that, a lot of the questions that are coming up here, and maybe different people have different answers, but at least we'll have the forum, different forums to continue asking those questions. And again, this is something that the online experience allowing us.
Yeah, I think Dorit is writing in the chat now that in education, in order to survive, you have to expose children to all sides of the spectrum from right to left, and whether it's online or not. And I have to say, I personally, at least in my educational approach, I said half jokingly, but really seriously, that comfort is not a Jewish value. And I think in Israel, education specifically, we are, and I shared this with Dorit and Ken in our preparation session, that I feel that Israel needs to now serve some sort of a comfort zone. So there's a lot of cooking Israel and singing Israel and doing a lot of comfort Israel, but it's not a comfortable place, not in the sense that sometimes in the physical sense. And I think that it's this discomfort, this culture of discomfort that we have Jewishly that creates meaning, and we really shouldn't be afraid to challenge it. As Riva was saying about, foods and songs and things that connect. I think connection is extremely important. And all of us, I know Orit and Ken and myself, of course, will be happy to help continue thinking about how we do discomfort in two dimensions, which is the online, definitely. Noah is saying, as educators, we're challenged how to use these platforms, whatever our agenda or content focuses, and the key is to make the platform engaging and a place for students, to feel meaning. We're 1 minute over time, so I want to give an opportunity for Professor Stein and for Lee to give us a final thought, maybe in the sense of, what is it that we're now gaining? I started by framing and saying we're ben ha-mitzarim, we're in between the straits, we're in dire straits. What is it that you think we're going to be taking with us as we reach the shore and the other side of this pandemic, hopefully sooner rather than later?
Shelley, I'm not sure we're going to be better off. I'm reminded of, well, I'll tell you why, because when the internet was introduced, we didn't know, we thought it would be a great benefit. And then we realized that what it did to students and students learning, it didn't enhance it very much. And in fact, it proved to do away with imagination. It proved to do away with individual thinking. I'm a little afraid that we're going to get so consumed by the method that we'll forget about the content. I'll go back to what I said at the very beginning. The key to all this will be the flexibility, the agility, the acrobatics of the teacher. Can they master this?
Wow, thank you. And I trust at least the educators, the 70 plus educators on this call, will be agile enough for the task, but I agree with you. There's a lot in our hands. Orit?
I think that among the different challenges, there's so many opportunities that I'm at least very, very excited about. And I think when you spoke about ben ha-mitzarim and we are now at sea and we're approaching a land, I think one of the things that we need to consider and take on board, it's that the land is going to be different. It's not going to be the same land as March 2020 or February 2020. And I think recreating, reimagining the land, re-examine what the land, obviously a metaphor, right? The land is offering us, looking inside the box. What are the assets, the community assets, partnerships, tools, all of those things that are happening, and how do we reimagine and reinvent? And this is really innovation, and having the process that support that and the infrastructure that supports that, that's really exciting for me as an educator and obviously as the head of the programs at the IAC. So I'm eager to see what's going to happen. I'm very, very optimistic of all the new stuff that we're going to see.
Thank you. I love that you said about, the land is different than the land that we've left, and it's 100% correct. Of course, the metaphor comes from what happens to the children of Israel. They leave one land and they reach a different land. It is the promised land. I don't know if we're reaching a promised land of any sort, but it's definitely something different. Ilana Moskin is inviting people for a meetup once session is over. I hope that people know where is happening. Matt is saying a cool thing to share their organizational partnership with the South African community. Fantastic. They visit Israel curriculum to 160 South Africans created next week by Zoom from Chicago. So we're very, very happy doing this. South Africa is an extremely important city to be supporting at this time. And all I said, educators have to harness the tools as our students have to introduce them to education. Yes, unfortunately, it is what we need to be doing. I want to just give a great shout out for IAC and Tel Aviv University for enabling us to chat to each other first and foremost. Ken and Wait, always a pleasure to discuss these really important matters with you. To thank all of you that have survived this hour of thinking and looking in different directions. We will try to cut and paste the chat. A lot of you have been writing to me privately in the chat that you would like to see all the resources that have been presented here. So we will try to cut and paste the chat and share it with everybody. Hopefully we can do that. Oh, fantastic. We have somebody here from South Africa, Natalie. Yeah, that's Cape Town, right? So fantastic. And the meetup connection is already pasted over there. So thank you very, very much for everybody for making this happen. Have a fantastic evening, afternoon, morning, and looking forward to good news and good health from all of your behalf.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Shelley.
Toda.
Done. Pronto.
Okay.